Good morning, everyone. This is Doug. This episode is entitled Why Demolishing the Virgin Birth with the Syriac Sinaiticus Bible, the discovery in the 1890s by Agnes Lewis, is essential to Christianity. And one of the proofs of it is the way of Rabbi Simmons has used this argument for many years. So let's just take a look at that. He is, in a recent article, this article, Do Jews Believe in Jesus, 2022, he says, in response to the virgin birth claim, or the attack on Jesus' Davidic lineage, the response of Christians is his claim that Joseph adopted Jesus and passed on his genealogy via adoption. There are two problems with this claim. There's no biblical basis for the idea of a father passing on his tribal line by adoption. A priest who adopts a son from another tribe cannot make him a priest by adoption. Second, Rabbi Simmons says, to answer this difficult problem, apologists for Christ claim that Jesus traces himself back to King David through his mother Mary, who allegedly descends from David, as shown in the third chapter of Luke, supposedly. There are four basic problems with this claim. A, there is no evidence that Mary descends from David. The third chapter of Luke traces Joseph's genealogy, not Mary's. Mr. Rood recently tried to take something that Mr. Nehemiah Gordon had said to suppose that Mary's father was a Levite, from the tribe of Judah, which would give him potentially the tribe lineage going back to David. But that Mr. Nehemiah Gordon made Mr. Rood take that back on air so that everybody would know he never said that. And there is no evidence of that from reading the text. And in fact, in Luke, it's very obvious that Mary is Levite because John the Baptist's parents were Levites, meaning Zechariah was the priest and he was a Levite, he was the father, and the mother had to be from the Levite tribe due to special rules that are applicable to Levite priests. They must marry a Levite woman. So if Mary's cousin is Elizabeth, who is marrying a Levite, then Elizabeth is a Levite, and that means Elizabeth's father has to be Levite to make this all work, which means Mary's sibling has to be Mary's parent has to be a sibling of Elizabeth's father. That means that Mary cannot herself pass on anything but a Levite lineage as a result. So therefore, there's no basis. In fact, if you know more than what Mr. Simmons is mentioning, you would know that it can't even be possible under Luke. But he's just saying, you can just tell reading it, it is trying to claim Joseph is the Davidic heir, not Mary. Why is it saying it has him going back to the city of Bethlehem because he's of the Davidic line? Him, Joseph, not Mary. So if it had been otherwise, it would have said because both Joseph and Mary were of the Davidic line, they're going to Bethlehem for taxation. But it says Joseph is of the Davidic line, and that's why they're going back to Bethlehem for taxation. So you just have to read the text and don't get deceived by people who just don't know what they're talking about. B, even if Mary can trace herself back to David, that doesn't help. Jesus, since tribal affiliation goes only through the father, not the mother. That's in Numbers 1, verse 18, and Ezra 2, verse 59. So that's another block. 3, even if family line could go through the mother, Mary was not from a legitimate messianic family, according to the Bible. The Messiah must be a descendant of David through his son Solomon. And it gives references. The third chapter of Luke is relevant to this discussion because it describes the lineage of David's son is Nathan, not Solomon, Luke 3:31. What does that prove to me? It proves to me that whoever created the fact that there is a fraudulent entire new version in Luke, which, by the way, in the Syriac Sinaiticus doesn't even appear. There's nothing of the Luke narrative at all. It's just simply there's a narrative of the birth of Jesus in Matthew. So the inference from what I would draw is that the Luke account was made up many decades later to try to fix the problems that were existent in the Matthew version, where you have a miscount, you have somebody miscounting the generations, and so on and so forth. So somebody was trying to do a repair job, and then they also didn't have just begat Jesus, so they had no proof that Jesus had a Davidic line at the very end. So all these things were obviously corruptions. I'm sorry to tell everybody. It's just we have to face reality. So whoever did it did not know Jewish law, did not know Jewish descendancy and genealogy rules, and so they make all these kind of blunders and mistakes. And that's just we have to acknowledge that and say, hey, but look at the Syriac Sinaiticus, my Jewish friends and family. Why don't you just say, I have one member of family, by the way, who's Jewish, and that's my Aunt Myra. Hi, Aunt Myra. And why don't you just take a look at the Syriac Sinaiticus? There is no Luke account of any birth of Jesus, okay? It just bypasses that, just like in Mark. And then why don't we go back to Matthew and say, hey, you know what? The Ebionites said this isn't how it read. It didn't even have any of this stuff either. It was Joseph begat Jesus, and that was it. So let's now go back now to the Syriac Sinaiticus issues. A famous Christian theologian, by the way, in 1908 had advocated what I'm saying is basically, let's rely upon the Syriac Sinaiticus to defend Christ being the Messiah, without which he can't be the Messiah. Therefore, the virgin birth account is something that is blocking people who should believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah, but they won't because we have a defective version that doesn't make any sense. So this is Friedrich de Leech. He says this in 1908 in this book. I have this book in our public domain list, and I'll provide that to anyone who asks. Common sense teaches us that these genealogies, whose sole aim is to prove that Jesus is the son and descendant of David through Joseph, the son and descendant of David, would be absolutely meaningless and useless if Joseph had not been the father of Jesus according to the flesh, if his fatherhood were only an appearance and Jesus were only a son of Mary. And that's right. It's clearly stating that Joseph is in the Davidic line, not saying Mary's in the Davidic line. And therefore, why is it left blank when it gets to the end? Joseph doesn't beget Jesus in the Greek text, but you're going to see in the Syriac text in the Matthew that has it, Joseph begat Jesus, and there's nothing in Luke at all. I'm going to show you the text from this book here. This will all be available to be seen here, but I want to read you the highlights from the Syriac Sinaiticus discussion in Hastings. And he'll say this is what's in the work that Agnes Lewis found. And she was a Cambridge scholar. She came there with the scholarly team, so we'll get into that in a second. The fact of the miraculous birth of the Savior is distinctly discredited, for this Syriac Codex says, number one, Matthew 1, verse 16 says, Joseph, to whom Mary, the virgin, was betrothed, begat Jesus, who was called Christ. And in verse 21, it reads, she shall bear thee, you, Joseph, a son. And in verse 25, it reads, it omits the words, and knew her not till, but instead says, he married his betrothed wife, and she bare him a son, and he called his name Jesus. Okay, so this is Horace Hastings at page XXX, BII, so lower Roman numeral 38, and we'll get into that in a second. There are many examples just from the New Testament. You would know that Jesus had to have been from the seed of David, from Joseph. That's the only one who's indicated in Matthew or in Luke as the Davidic line, just by looking at things like Acts 2:30. This talks about the prophecy of Jesus' birth, which required he would be of the true lineage of David. So this is reference back to 2 Samuel 7, verse 8 to 16. And this is Peter speaking. Therefore, David being a prophet, and knowing that God had sworn with an oath to him that of the fruit of his loins, according to flesh, he would raise up Christ, Messiah, to sit on the throne. Okay, that's the King James Version. So now let me read 2 Samuel 7, verses 8 to 16 for you, so you can understand why this is so determinative, and that the Rabbi Simmons is not misleading anyone. He's telling the truth. Beginning with verse 8. The Lord, Yahweh, declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you, David. Verse 12. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. Verse 13. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Verse 14. I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he does wrong, I will punish him with a rod wielded by men, with floggings inflicted by human hands. I'm going to pause there. So don't be shocked about that. A lot of Christians don't know that children are not guilty of any sin until they reach an age of knowing right from wrong. That's in Isaiah chapter 7, where it's a prophecy about the son of Isaiah's own wife is the woman who's pregnant at that time. A young woman is giving birth to a son and will name him Emmanuel. That's the name of the son of Isaiah. And when he reaches knowing the difference between right and wrong, then a certain prophecy would be triggered for the benefit of the kingdom of the south, and that would lead to basically no longer would the northern kingdom of Israel or the Assyrian kingdom be sieging onto the kingdom of the south of Judah. And that actually what got fulfilled and is mentioned as a prophetic fulfillment later in the book of Isaiah. So that prophecy got fulfilled. And of course, you should all know there's been a major mistranslation of that passage. The woman talked about was a woman who had already given birth once. Isaiah had one child already. The second child would be Emmanuel. And somehow somebody just completely took this out of context and trying to rewrite our New Testament, make up a fictitious story, made basically a blunder. Okay, but you can see here what's most crucial for us to care about, and what the Jewish people are saying. Hey, look, he has to be from the offspring of flesh and blood, and he has to be therefore of the father's line, and it can't be from Mary anyway. Okay, and we find the same thing in Romans, Timothy, and Acts, that this is Paul speaking in each of these three instances, and he says that Jesus was born of the seed of David. And most importantly, take a look at Acts 13. If Acts 13, and going back to this passage in Acts 2, if for any reason Luke is writing the gospel and he's then writing the book of Acts, and he compares the two, he would have to say, oh, Joseph didn't beget Jesus over here. I just led everyone to believe I was going that way, and then it suddenly was Mary, which breaks the lineage necessity that Samuel would require from the line of David through the male line. So I don't think, my friends, that Luke could have possibly written the book of Luke with a virgin birth. Okay, and so that perfectly explains why there is no virgin birth account in the Agnus Luis Syriac Sinaiticus at all. It doesn't even have that. There's not even a hint of it. So here's some background on the Syriac Sinaiticus, or sometimes called the Sinaitic Syriac, from Mr. Horace Hastings, beginning at page lower Roman numeral 38. In 1858, Dr. William Cureton published an edition of the Syriac Gospels with an English translation from certain manuscripts brought from the monastery of St. Mary Daipara in the valley of the Natron Lakes near Egypt in 1842. Now, this is not Agnus Luis. This is somebody predating Agnes. This Syriac version differed from the Peshitta and was regarded as more ancient, though less accurate and complete. No other manuscript of this version was known to exist. So that, by the way, establishes that the lineage that Agnes is finding is going to be in the same lineage, but even older. The Covenant of St. Catherine's at the base of Mount Sinai, where Tischendorf discovered the well-known Sinaitic Greek manuscript, holds valuable literary treasures. But the monks, since their experience with Tischendorf, having come to know the value of their manuscripts, are jealous that they should be despoiled of their treasure. It was in February 1892 that two ladies from England, twin sisters, Mrs. Agnes Smith Lewis, widow of Reverend Savage Lewis, late fellow and librarian of Corpus Christi College, Cambridge, and Mrs. Margaret Dunlop Gibson, visited the convent of St. Catherine, and being suitably introduced and able to converse in modern Greek, the mother tongue of the monks, they met with a cordial reception and were allowed exceptional privileges. In their explorations of decaying manuscripts, they came upon an old Syriac manuscript of 358 pages, dating back to AD 778, containing lives of certain ancient female saints, which had been written over some earlier writing, which was faded and partly erased. I'm going to pause there. That's going to be the Syriac Sinaiticus. So it was being overwritten by a story about the lives of women, but in between, they could figure out there was something there. Let's continue. With their photographic apparatus, these ladies photographed nearly all of this old palimpsest, bringing the films to England for development, and there Mr. F.C. Burkitt and Robert L. Bensley deciphered some of the older writing, and Mr. Bensley identified it as a manuscript of the long-sought Cureton Syriac, or some closely allied versions of the Gospels. Early in 1893, the same ladies, accompanied by Messieurs Burkitt, Bensley, and Professor J. Rendell Harris, revisited the convent of St. Catherine, and in February and March transcribed this ancient codex using chemicals to restore the faded letters, which were too faint to be distinctly photographed. The Syriac manuscript thus recovered and contained nearly the whole of the four Gospels, about 8 pages being defective. The Syriac Gospels have been issued from the Cambridge Press, and an English translation by Mrs. Lewis has also appeared. Yes. These Gospels are valued for their antiquity, though for practical purposes, this more crude version can never compete with the more accurate Peshitta. Now, I'm leaving that in. He's definitely biased towards the work he's looking at, a translation that somebody else did, Mr. Murdoch did, in the 1700s. So he isn't professing to have any expertise at all. He doesn't have to know anything about Syriac himself. He's just taking a translation from a guy who was born in late 1770s. And that's what he's doing. So I want you to just hear what he's saying. They may, however, serve to shed some light on perplexing critical problems. In the Gospel of Mark, the last 12 verses are wanting. In Luke 2, verse 14, the reading is goodwill towards men. So he's saying we can fix things using it. So he's saying he sees some value, but the virgin birth is not going to be something he wants to see any value in. We'll see. And these long discarded Syriac Gospels, now he's making it sound like they were thrown away. No, that's not true here. This was not found in the trash. He's mixing up. Tischendorf found the Codex Sinaiticus in the garbage, but these weren't discarded. In fact, they were actually being kept. They were treasure of the lives of women. But what was happening is they ran out of paper, and so somebody was writing over them, and that's all that was going on. Let's continue. In these Syriac Gospels may also be found one of the rare instances of intentional interpolations. That's his inference, not theirs. In the text, which this version shares pretty closely with a small family of old Latin manuscripts. Thus, the fact of the miraculous birth of the Savior is distinctly discredited for this Syriac Codex. So he's trying to make it as if it was written to discredit it instead of being it's the original. I'm just showing you how language and words and verbiage is used to make conclusions sound plausible. Okay. It says in Matthew 1:16, Joseph, to whom Mary, the virgin, was betrothed, begat Jesus, who was also called Christ. So, who is the father? Joseph begat Jesus. You can see it right there. And in verse 21, it reads, she shall bear you a son. And in verse 25, it omits the words, and knew her not till. So it no longer has that, he didn't know her till. So the idea of conception was no longer being virginal. But says instead, and he, Joseph, married his betrothed wife, and she bare him a son, and he called his name Jesus. Okay. Okay, now I'm not going to go into much more detail here. I want to point out one thing on this next slide is he's going to attribute the account here being Ebionite influence over the document. So the Ebionites were considered heretics for believing Jesus was a son of David, and the Trinity is false. So the Trinity is false became even so important that you would just disregard the fact that the other argument about the virgin birth is essential to Christianity's existence and just ignore that. Okay, but I'm going to skip over that, and I just want to read you here. He quotes Luke 3:23 from the Syriac Sinaiticus that Agnes was found, that it says, but Jesus, being only about 30 years old, called as he was a son of Joseph. So he was called as he was a son of Joseph. That means he was a son of Joseph, and doesn't mean he was not the son of Joseph. And that means we have another evidence, even in the book of Luke, that the way it originally read is he was called as he was, son of Joseph. I want to show you that Agnes Lewis's discovery was mentioned in another work by one of the teammates in the Cambridge team, Mr. Burkitt, I mentioned earlier. He was a university lecturer in paleography, so that was his expertise, and looking at this document must have been, right down his alley. And he gives the translation of what he himself was involved in. Jacob begat Joseph. Joseph, to whom was betrothed Mary, the Virgin, begat Jesus, that is called the Messiah. This is page 5 of Evangelion de Mephibosheth, the Curitan version of the four Gospels, and he includes the early Syriac patristic evidence edited. So he is definitely backing up what is in the same book by Agnes Lewis on the same text, looking at the same text. It also mentions the omission of before having relations in verse 25, as I'd already referenced earlier. So he backs her up on that, and that's key. There's no mention that it was a virgin birth, and that these words are pivotal to make it a virgin birth. Before they had relations would mean she was born. She had a child before they even consummated marriage. And this is at page 7, footnote 23 of the book I just showed you. And if there's any doubt in your friend's mind or you're trying to convince, tell them Luke is quoted in the 200s, the early 200s, by Tertullian in the flesh of Christ in a passage that we know today in Luke 8, verses 19 to 21, but it read a bit differently, apparently. This is what Tertullian recorded. And again, this is the time period where in approximately this time, the Ebionite church is going to scream holy murder that someone has translated into Greek the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew into something that corrupted it and added a virgin birth. And like I said, they hired Syriac. So let's read what Tertullian says. You can find this anywhere online. The Lord's brethren had not yet believed in him. He's quoting Luke in that verse. So is it contained in the gospel which was published before Marcion's time, whilst there is at the same time a want of evidence of his mother's adherence to him, although the Marthas and the other Marys were in constant attendance on him, in this very passage, one I just quoted you, indeed, their unbelief is evident. Jesus was teaching the way of life, preaching the kingdom of God, and actively engaged in healing infirmities of body and soul, but all the while strangers were intent on him, his very nearest relatives were absent. And remember, he's quoting it saying, the Lord's brethren had not yet believed in him. So Mary's there, the mother's present, and that's when Jesus responds, who is my mother and father? And he points to the people. He says, whoever follows me is my mother, my brother, sister, and my mother. So it's obvious he's putting down his mother and brethren when he says that. And the interesting thing is the first mention of a virgin birth account appears in Irenaeus's writings in about 180 AD. Okay, so that's why I pegged the Ebionite dispute right around 180 to 200 AD, where Tertullian could be overlapping at the same time. Irenaeus around 180 AD criticizes the Ebionites, that's the Church of Jerusalem, for insisting that Jesus' father was Joseph and not solely conceived by a virgin. This is the first documented reference to the virgin birth account in church history, but we are presuming his writings themselves were not tampered with. Irenaeus explains, God then was made man, and the Lord did himself save us, giving us the token of the virgin. I'm going to pause there. Very pagan, unbelievably pagan, because that's how all the gods work. They were born of a virgin, and they live, and when they're born, they're miraculously operating. So this is where it's coming from. That's what the urge is, to document it that way. Not as some allege among those now presuming to expound the scriptures. Thus, behold, a young woman shall conceive and bring forth a son, Isaiah 7:14, as Theodotion the Ephesian has interpreted it, and Aquila of Pontus. So I just want you to see something. He is citing the dispute. So the Ebionites stormed up in arms over the fact that the translation of Isaiah 7:14 says young virgin in Greek, when in Latin, in Hebrew, it's young woman. And so in support of this argument, even Irenaeus mentions Theodotion says it's young woman, and so does Aquila of Pontus. So these are top translators. So guess what he says? Both Jewish proselytes. So he's dismissing them. They're Jewish, so we don't have to listen to their translations. But they were not translating for us. They were translating for the world, and that's why they're in the works of Origen when he creates his Exapla, which takes all these parallels and puts them side by side. He takes all the top experts, Syriac, Theodotion, and so on. Let's continue. The Ebionites, following these, the people who translate it correctly, in my opinion, assert that he was begotten by Joseph. Necessarily so, sir, unless you don't believe Jesus can be, you want to destroy Christianity, thus destroying as far as in them lies such a marvelous dispensation of God. So he doesn't care about whether it's good or right or wrong. It's just what a wonderful story. What a wonderful dispensation God gave us of birth of Jesus through a virgin. That is not a basis for making this decision, Irenaeus. I'm sorry. And setting aside the testimony of the prophets which proceeded from God, they did not say. They said this, young woman would give birth, not a virgin. And that's important in the context of that. It was a prophecy about Isaiah's own wife. She was already had one child before, and she was going to have a second child. And she was the predicate woman. She's a young woman, has a child. She will call her son Emmanuel, which they do. Isaiah calls his son Emmanuel later. Emmanuel grows up, and the prophecy was when Emmanuel grows up and he can tell right from wrong, that's when it triggers the prophecy about what's going to happen to Assyria and the enemy of the northern kingdom of Israel against the government of the kingdom of Judea in the south, which is the king. That king of that Judea kingdom is seeking reassurance, and Isaiah says, "Here's going to be the sign that will let you know when this birth of this child happens. You will call him Emmanuel, and then you will wait till he reaches maturity, and then you'll know when that son reaches maturity. You'll know." that this prophecy was there to tell you you wouldn't be under attack. If you wait that long, don't engage until then, and you won't have to fight any battles. And that's what he does. By the way, this is in Philip Schaff, Apostolic Fathers, Volume 1, Chapter 21. You can get it at this ccel.org link. Okay, I'm going to give you a quotation here. Epiphanius in the mid-300s said, the Ebionites following these other sources assert that he, Jesus, was begotten by Joseph. Were they right? Yes, they were. And they had to be. And if they weren't right, then Jesus can't be Messiah. Again, I must reiterate that. In Paul and Jesus, at page 225, Dr. DeBoer comments on the Ebionites. The best known group, and the one that drew the most fire from Orthodox Pauline circles, see, that's the enemy of the Ebionites, are the Paulinists, were the Ebionites. It is certainly plausible to assume that the Ebionites represent a link to the Jerusalem apostles. Who's closer to the true 12? Oh, the Ebionites. At least in their main ideas. That's at page 223 to 224. Then at page 225, he says, the ultimate irony with regard to what Christianity became is the possibility that these voices that no longer speak might well represent something closer to the message of Jesus than do the teachings of Paul or Christianity itself. What an amazing admission. I want to also read you something that just bears on common sense. Again, a scholar can express these things very well. J.R. Wilkinson, he was a renowned scholar of his day, in an article entitled Mr. Corneviere's Textual Theories, Hibbert Journal, October 1902, page 96. It's also in the Hibbert Journal, 1904 through 54. I'm going to skip a couple of paragraphs here and get to the meat of it. Page 355. The text of the Sinaiticus, that's the Syriac Sinaiticus we call today, alone seems to postulate such a clause, that is, Joseph begat Jesus. And is it possible to believe anyone would have taken the trouble to construct the long line of natural descent if at the last step natural descent were to play no part? This inconsistency is best seen in the genealogy of St. Luke, whereas Holtzman justly remarks, it is absurd to assume an evangelist would take the trouble to construct the long genealogy of our Lord through Joseph, and then, as it were, spoil all of that he had done by adding that Joseph was only accounted or supposed to be the son of Joseph. The construction of such genealogies presupposes natural descent throughout. It is evident that in both St. Matthew and Luke, correction has taken place, page 356. In the case of St. Luke, a very clumsy correction, so as to render these genealogies consistent with a virgin birth. Okay, so let's take a look at a couple of references that predate the period of time where the Ebion go crazy, and it's just quoted matter-of-factly by Justin Martyr in his dialogue with Trypho, exactly identical to the Syriac Sinaiticus. Okay, this is something that wasn't observed until many years later, around 1905. So let me just show you here. Sinai Syriac text of Matthew 1:16, that Joseph begat Jesus, is confirmed by the dialogue of Timothy and Aquila, published by Conybeare in 1898. Okay, so let's read what the dialogue reads. And if you remember what I've read you, it's going to be identical to the Syriac Sinaiticus. Jacob begat Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, who was called Christ. And Joseph begat Jesus, who is called Christ. That's the same. And by the way, somebody said, I couldn't find that in First Apology of Justin Martyr. I didn't see Jacob begat Joseph was not found. Well, we went to the extra labor to find this in a source text that he couldn't dispute, Mr. Burkett, Volume 2, and this is his reference to Dialogue of Timothy and Aquila, edited by Conybeare, 1898. I just referenced that as well. That's where he had to research the book I cited, but he didn't apparently, because we found it right here. Here is the book quoted by this scholar. Burkett is quoting that book I quoted earlier, and it says right here, and so there's a dialogue between a Christian and a Jewish person, and talks about a genealogy in the Old Testament, and in the New, there is one in Matthew, and it runs thus. Jacob begat Joseph, the husband of Mary, from whom was born Jesus, that is called Christ. Wow. And Joseph begat Jesus, that is called Christ, about whom we are talking. It says he begat him from Mary. Okay, so it still constantly keeps saying he was Jacob begat Joseph, the husband of Mary, from whom was born Jesus, that is called Christ, and it's emphatic, and so Joseph begat Jesus. See that? That's the commonality that you can't get away from. That's what it said in the Syriac Sinaiticus. That's what it says in Dialogue of Timothy and Aquila. And so people who try to do research and don't really do good research have to realize, you know, that's why I put all these things on the screen. That's why I give you the source references. So I said where it came from, and you got to go look. That's all I'm going to say. You have to research it. You have to read the book. And if you don't do it on a word search basis, that means you should read the whole book and then not leap to conclusions because you haven't done the whole work. You're just doing a word search. That's not always effective. Let's continue. And this is Cornybert. So I went and got Cornybert's work. It's the Dialogues of Athanasius and Syriac and of Timothy and Aquila. So let's go to the root source, the 1898 text. Let's see what he says. Okay, so I didn't want to leave any stone unturned. And that's where, this is where it is here on the right, in Greek. Okay, so that's the translation. These are parallel texts, okay? So that was the end of that. So hopefully, if you are dealing with someone who doesn't want to give up the virgin birth account as a Christian and they're still finding their faith, that's fine, but they're never going to be an evangelist to someone who has a question mark about it. And in this modern era, this isn't going to go away. This is going to raise its ugly head no matter what we do. It's already been raised by numerous Jewish people. Tobias Singer now is bringing it up regularly. The virgin birth defeats Christianity. I could have shown you several videos of his on that. I don't think I need to do that. I think you probably have seen them yourselves. That means Christianity is going to be destroyed unless we come up with an answer to these arguments, because you cannot base it on just myth and tradition. That won't convince people who don't come from your tradition and background. You need to prove it to them. And if you don't have proof that makes a logical sense, you can't win. And therefore, you're going to leave people that you want to lead to Christ, they can't believe because you don't have any substantial basis to what you believe. All right. God bless everybody. Take care. Ciao. Bye.